In a luxury flight, a privileged socialite's demand to remove Big Shaq from first class quickly spirals into a mind-twisting game of secrets, deception, and hidden identities. As tensions rise mid-air, the passengers realize, this isn't just an argument, it's a trap. Who is Big Shaq? What is Eleanor Whitmore hiding? And when the plane lands, who will still be in control? This flight is about to change everything. Before we deep dive into this interesting story, subscribe to our channel and tell us where are you watching from. Share in the comments below. The first-class cabin of Flight 762 from New York to London exuded quiet opulence. Plush leather seats, champagne flutes delicately placed on trays, and the faint hum of classical music in the background made it an exclusive sanctuary above the clouds. The passengers, some CEOs, some discreet government officials, and a few recognizable celebrities, settled into their seats, preparing for the long-haul flight. The air smelled of luxury and quiet power, but beneath it all, there was an undercurrent of unspoken tension. In the last row of first class, Big Shaq adjusted his watch, his fingers tapping absently on the armrest. Tall, broad-shouldered, and exuding quiet confidence, he was an imposing presence, yet there was something unusually controlled about him. His suit, subtle yet impeccable, suggested wealth, but his demeanor held the air of someone who didn't need to prove anything. He kept to himself, scanning the cabin with sharp, knowing eyes. As he reached for his drink, his gaze locked onto a woman across the aisle, a woman who in that very moment had stiffened in her seat, her manicured fingers tightening around the stem of her glass. Eleanor Whitmore, mid-50s, dripping in pearls, and radiating an air of privilege, sat upright as if the air had suddenly become thick with discomfort. Her face, meticulously sculpted with age-defying procedures, twisted into something between disbelief and anger. She recognized him. The change in her demeanor was instant. She glanced around as if expecting someone to confirm what she was seeing. Then, with barely contained irritation, she turned to the flight attendant. "Excuse me," she whispered sharply, her voice laced with urgency. "I think there's been a mistake." The young flight attendant, dressed in a crisp navy uniform, leaned in with a polite smile. "Ma'am?" Eleanor gestured subtly toward Big Shaq, her lips pressing into a thin line. "That man," she said, her voice just loud enough for nearby passengers to hear. "I don't think he belongs here." A ripple of uneasy silence passed through the cabin. Some passengers shifted in their seats, others subtly glanced in Shaq's direction. The flight attendant hesitated, glancing between Eleanor and Shaq, clearly unsure of how to respond. Big Shaq didn't react. He merely swirled the amber liquid in his glass and took a slow sip. He had seen this before. The doubt, the quiet hostility wrapped in politeness. The attendant cleared her throat. "Mr. Shaq is a first-class passenger, ma'am." Eleanor's lips pursed. "I paid for exclusivity, for a certain level of clientele." Her voice was sharp now, a hint of suppressed fury beneath the surface. "I don't feel comfortable sitting near him." A few seats away, a businessman in his 60s lowered his newspaper and exchanged a knowing look with the woman beside him. Across the aisle, a younger man, possibly a tech entrepreneur, raised an eyebrow but said nothing. The silence in the cabin was growing thicker. Big Shaq finally spoke, his voice deep and measured. "Is there a problem?" Eleanor turned her head slowly, as if only now acknowledging him directly. Her lips parted slightly, then closed, as if second-guessing what she was about to say. There was something in his eyes, not aggression, not intimidation, but an unnerving calmness that made her pulse quicken. The flight attendant forced a smile. "Of course not, sir. Just a small misunderstanding." Eleanor leaned in closer. "I know exactly who you are," she whispered, her voice just above a breath. For the first time, Big Shaq's fingers stopped moving. His eyes remained unreadable, but there was a shift in his energy, just for a second. Then, just as quickly, he smirked. "Do you?" he asked, voice low, almost amused. Eleanor's jaw clenched. Her fingers trembled slightly as she reached for her champagne but thought better of it. She turned back to the flight attendant. "I want to speak to the captain, now." The tension in the cabin had become palpable. Other passengers, even those pretending not to eavesdrop, were now fully engaged in the silent drama unfolding before them. The flight attendant hesitated. "Ma'am, the captain is preparing for takeoff. If you'd like, I can—" "I said now." Eleanor's voice was sharp, brittle. She wasn't just irritated, she was afraid. Big Shaq watched her carefully, taking in every detail. The way she kept glancing toward the other VIP passengers, the way she clenched and unclenched her fists. She wasn't just angry about him being here. She was worried about something. Just then, the intercom crackled to life. "Cabin crew, prepare for takeoff." Eleanor let out a breath, glancing toward the cockpit. The moment had passed, for now. The flight attendant gave an apologetic nod and hurried away, leaving Eleanor sitting stiffly in her seat, arms crossed, lips pursed. Big Shaq exhaled slowly, rolling his shoulders back. He glanced at the man 3 rows ahead of him, the one who had lowered his newspaper earlier. Their eyes met for the briefest moment, an unspoken exchange passing between them. This flight was going to be a long one. As the engines roared and the plane lifted off the ground, Eleanor closed her eyes. Whatever she had hoped to avoid was now inevitable. She knew exactly who Big Shaq was, and worse, she knew why he was here. The aircraft had settled into a smooth cruise, but inside the first-class cabin, tension crackled like static electricity before a storm. Flight attendants moved briskly, ensuring drinks were poured and blankets were distributed, but all eyes kept drifting back to Eleanor Whitmore. She had spent the last half hour shifting uncomfortably in her seat, stealing glances at Big Shaq, the way someone would observe a ticking bomb in a crowded room. Every passing second, her discomfort seemed to ferment into something more potent: anger. Finally, with a sharp exhale, she straightened, pressed the call button, and waited. Within moments, a different flight attendant arrived, a senior one this time, her badge reading Amelia. Her face was lined with the calm patience of someone who had spent years diffusing high-maintenance passengers. But as soon as Eleanor locked eyes with her, she knew this would be different. "How can I assist you, ma'am?" Amelia asked, her voice smooth, diplomatic. Eleanor leaned in slightly, her manicured fingers tapping against the armrest. "I already raised my concern earlier, and nothing has been done. That man," she inclined her head towards Big Shaq, "should not be here." Amelia blinked, but her posture remained professional. "Mr. Shaq is a confirmed first-class passenger, ma'am." Eleanor let out a sharp laugh, the kind meant to undermine rather than amuse. "A confirmed passenger?" she repeated, voice dripping with incredulity. "I find that hard to believe." A few heads turned, conversations hushed. The tension was no longer simmering. It was at a rolling boil. Big Shaq, who had been sipping his drink in silence, finally set his glass down and turned slightly in his seat, acknowledging the scene unfolding around him. But he did not speak. Not yet. Eleanor continued, emboldened by the gathering audience. "I paid for this seat. I paid for the exclusivity of this section. Now, I don't know how he got here, but I would like this rectified, immediately." The word "he" dripped with emphasis, coded in something unspoken but deeply understood by everyone listening. Amelia's jaw tightened. She knew this game, had seen it before. The entitled arrogance, the thinly veiled prejudice wrapped in decorum. But this time, something felt different. Big Shaq exhaled, slow and deliberate, and turned to face Eleanor fully. The movement was subtle, yet it commanded attention. "Tell me," he said, his voice smooth, composed. "What exactly is it that bothers you?" The cabin fell into a hush. Eleanor's lips parted just slightly, caught off guard by the directness of his question. "Excuse me?" she said. Shaq tilted his head, his expression unreadable. "You seem very unsettled. What about my presence disturbs you so much?" A flicker of something dangerous passed through Eleanor's eyes. "Don't twist my words," she snapped. "This is about standards." A scoff came from somewhere, a younger woman a few seats away, watching with amused disdain. "Oh, this is about standards now?" she muttered, just loud enough to be heard. Eleanor's spine stiffened. She turned toward Amelia again. "I want to speak to the captain." Amelia hesitated. "Ma'am, the captain is occupied. If this is about seating, I assure you—" "No." Eleanor's voice sharpened. I want him removed from this section. Now, even the passengers who had tried to remain indifferent found themselves drawn in. A suited businessman furrowed his brow. A middle-aged woman clasped her hands in her lap, shifting uneasily. A young man in a leather jacket adjusted his earbuds, now fully invested in the real-life drama unfolding before him. Amelia's patience visibly thinned. With all due respect, ma'am, you do not have the authority to request another passenger's removal. Eleanor's face flushed, a mix of humiliation and indignation. Then upgrade me. Move me somewhere else. Before Amelia could respond, another voice cut through the cabin. Why don't you leave? It was the woman across the aisle, the one who had scoffed earlier. Her name was Naomi, a corporate lawyer with a sharp tongue and an even sharper intolerance for nonsense. Eleanor turned sharply. Excuse me? Naomi set down her book and leaned back, her expression unimpressed. You're the only one making a scene. If you have a problem, feel free to exit at 30,000 feet. A chuckle came from somewhere, muffled but unmistakable. Eleanor's lips pressed into a thin line. How dare you? Naomi raised an eyebrow. No, how dare you? What gives you the right to decide who belongs here? Eleanor's jaw tightened, her nostrils flaring slightly. I don't have to justify myself to you. Naomi smirked. You don't have to. You already did. Big Shaq, still calm, still unbothered, finally spoke again. Interesting, he mused, almost to himself. I don't recall seeing you at the gate. Eleanor blinked, caught off guard. What? Shaq tilted his head, studying her with an intensity that suddenly made her uncomfortable. You boarded before me. Yet the moment you saw me, you reacted like I wasn't supposed to be here. Like I surprised you. The cabin seemed to pause, a collective silence falling over the passengers. Shaq's voice lowered just slightly, his words deliberate. Why? Eleanor faltered. Just for a fraction of a second. But it was there. A break in her confidence. She recovered quickly. This is ridiculous. I don't have to explain myself. Shaq let the silence stretch. Then, finally, he offered a small, unreadable smile. No, you don't. Eleanor looked toward Amelia again, but something shifted in the flight attendant's expression. Where there had been polite appeasement before, there was now firmness. She wasn't going to indulge this any further. Ma'am, Amelia said, straightening. Unless you have a legitimate security concern, this discussion is over. Eleanor inhaled sharply, clearly caught between pride and realization. Another voice joined in, the businessman in the third row. Maybe you should just let it go. A younger man near the window shrugged. You're embarrassing yourself. Eleanor's breath came a little faster. Her hands curled into fists in her lap. The power dynamic had shifted, and she was on the losing side. She had expected agreement, validation. Instead, she had become the spectacle. Her gaze flickered to Shaq, her mind racing. Number, this isn't how it was supposed to go. Shaq lifted his glass again, taking a slow sip before setting it down. I didn't ask for this seat, he said, his voice quiet but carrying weight. It was assigned to me, just like it was assigned to you. He let the words sink in before adding, almost as an afterthought. Strange how life works, isn't it? Eleanor's pulse spiked. She didn't know why, but something about that last line, something about the way he said it, made her stomach tighten with unease. Shaq held her gaze for a moment longer. Then, with the smallest of nods, he turned back toward his drink, as if she had already ceased to exist. And just like that, the conversation was over. Eleanor felt it, the shift in energy, the quiet judgment settling over her like an unwanted weight. She turned forward stiffly, refusing to meet the eyes of anyone around her. Outside the window, the sky stretched endlessly into the horizon, but inside, the air had never felt so suffocating. The first-class cabin was no longer just a space of luxury. It had become a pressure cooker of silent stares, suppressed questions, and unspoken tension. The confrontation between Eleanor and Big Shaq had left a lingering charge in the air, something unsettling, something unfinished. Passengers had resumed sipping their drinks, pretending to be absorbed in their tablets or half-read books, but their eyes betrayed them. They were watching. They were listening. They just didn't want to be caught in the act. Big Shaq remained unbothered, his posture relaxed, gaze steady. He had learned a long time ago that silence was the sharpest weapon, and right now, it was cutting through Eleanor's carefully curated confidence like a blade. Then it happened. A slight intake of breath. From seat 3A, a man in his late 40s, dressed in an expensive yet subtle gray suit, had just caught sight of Shaq. His face registered something between recognition and shock, but he quickly masked it behind an expressionless stare. Big Shaq noticed. He always noticed. The man, however, did not speak. He adjusted his cuffs, looked away, and pretended that whatever had just clicked in his mind hadn't happened. But Eleanor saw it too, and for the first time since she had begun this absurd campaign against Big Shaq, she looked afraid. The color drained slightly from her already porcelain skin. Her fingers, perfectly manicured, tightened around the armrest as though holding on to something invisible. Big Shaq exhaled, slow and deliberate, and finally, for the first time, looked directly at the man in 3A. The man refused to meet his gaze. Passengers, already on edge, had sensed the shift. They exchanged glances, some leaning subtly toward each other, whispering beneath their breaths. Something was happening. A flight attendant strolled through the aisle, breaking the tension for a moment. But just as she reached the front of the first-class section, her device buzzed. A direct message. Unknown. Sender. Do not trust him. He should not be on this flight. She frowned, glancing around as if expecting someone to be watching her. Her fingers hovered over the screen. There was no sender ID, no way to trace where the message had come from. Uneasy, she stole a glance at Big Shaq. Had someone just sent this about him? At that exact moment, Eleanor caught her staring, and for the first time in the entire flight, Eleanor looked like she wanted to disappear. The young flight attendant, Amelia, was no fool. She had handled her share of high-maintenance passengers. But this was different. She turned to check the device again, but before she could, something else happened. The plane's Wi-Fi went out. Just like that. Passengers groaned in frustration as their screens froze midstream. Browsers refused to load. Emails remained unsent. Some dismissed it as a technical glitch, but others, they knew better. Something wasn't right. Eleanor's breath hitched. She turned slightly, her gaze darting around the cabin as if expecting something, or someone, to make a move. Shaq saw it. She wasn't just an arrogant woman trying to assert dominance over a first-class seat. She was hiding something. The businessman in seat 3A reached for his drink with a too-casual grip, his hand trembling slightly. The tension in the air thickened. And then, Shaq did something that made every passenger hold their breath. He leaned forward slightly, resting his arms on his knees, his voice impossibly calm as he spoke. Seems like the flight's taken an interesting turn. Eleanor flinched at the sound of his voice. The man in 3A stiffened. Passengers looked around, some in confusion, some in intrigue. Shaq's eyes, sharp and unreadable, flickered toward the flight attendant. "What did your message say?" he asked. Amelia's stomach flipped. She hadn't said anything. She hadn't even looked at him directly, and yet, he knew. Eleanor suddenly stood up. "I need to move seats." Her voice was tight, unnatural, as though her throat was closing up. Amelia blinked. "Excuse me, ma'am." Eleanor's breathing was uneven now, her fingers clutching the pearls around her neck. "I said I want to move." Passengers turned in their seats. The mighty Eleanor Whitmore was backing down. Big Shaq's expression remained unreadable. He didn't move, didn't gloat, didn't speak. He just watched. Eleanor's chest rose and fell as she turned toward Amelia again, eyes wide with something beyond anger. Pure fear. "You don't understand." Her voice cracked. "I can't sit near him." Shaq tilted his head slightly, his voice low and measured. "Why not?" Eleanor opened her mouth, but no words came out. And then, before anyone could process the unraveling chaos, a second phone buzzed. This time, it was the man in 3A. He pulled it out, read the message, and went deadly pale. Passengers noticed. Whispers grew. Eleanor saw his reaction, and her breathing became erratic. She knew what he had just read. Shaq exhaled, slow and deliberate. "You seem nervous, Ms. Whitmore." Her head snapped toward him. "Shut up." Gasps rippled through the cabin. The woman who had carried herself with elegance, superiority, and unshakable confidence was now crumbling in real time. The businessman in 3A, hands shaking slightly, stood up. The passengers stared at him now. He turned to Amelia, his voice eerily calm. "Who else got the message?" Amelia's breath caught. I don't know what you mean." Big Shaq finally leaned back, rolling his shoulders as if this were all mildly amusing. "I think you do," he murmured. The lights above flickered once. Passengers held their breath. Outside, the plane soared at 40,000 feet. Inside, in this small, confined space of leather seats and whispers, the air had become something else entirely. A game, a puzzle, a mystery none of them understood, except for Big Shaq, and the two people who were terrified of him. The silence in the first-class cabin had evolved into something heavier, something almost tangible. Conversations had dwindled to whispers, and the uneasy glances exchanged between passengers carried a weight that no one dared to acknowledge outright. Eleanor Whitmore sat rigid in her seat, her once unshakable composure now hanging by a thread. Her eyes, usually filled with entitlement, flickered between Big Shaq and the man in seat 3A, as if trapped between fight and flight. Across the aisle, Big Shaq remained a picture of calm. His fingers traced the rim of his glass, his expression unreadable, but his mind? His mind was sharp, calculating. He had been here before, and he knew Eleanor had been too. But how? That was the missing piece. Then, Eleanor did something unexpected. She smirked. It was small, just a flicker at the corner of her lips, but it was there. A knowing, taunting expression. She leaned forward, resting her elbow on the armrest, and in a voice only Shaq could hear, she whispered, "I know who you are." Shaq didn't blink, didn't flinch, but inside, something shifted. She wasn't guessing. She knew, and that meant one thing. His past had just caught up with him. Somewhere deep in his mind, the memories stirred. A cold interrogation room, the scent of stale coffee, a ticking clock on the wall. He had sat across from men who smiled too much, spoke too little, and knew far too much. They weren't asking for information. They were waiting for him to slip. And Eleanor Whitmore? She had been there too. Not in that room, but in the world that surrounded it. The circles of wealth, power, and influence that dictated the game from behind closed doors. And now, she was sitting across from him on a plane. Coincidence? Not a chance. Shaq's fingers tightened around his glass for a fraction of a second before he forced himself to relax. He turned his gaze to Eleanor, his voice as smooth as ever. "Do you?" he murmured. Eleanor's smirk deepened. "Oh, I do." A few rows ahead, the man in seat 3A stiffened, his hands pressing into his thighs. He knew it too. The past wasn't just creeping in, it was slamming into the present at full force. A few feet away, a man who had remained quiet for most of the flight suddenly shifted in his seat. He wasn't dressed like the others, no tailored suits, no casual luxury. His clothes were practical, forgettable. But his eyes, they were anything but. He had been watching Shaq for a while now, pretending not to. He had seen Eleanor's panic, the flicker of recognition from seat 3A, and the unspoken tension threading through the air like an invisible noose. His fingers tapped against the tray table, once, twice. Then, he reached into his jacket pocket. Amelia, the senior flight attendant, happened to catch the movement. She had seen that kind of reach before, a subtle, calculated motion. A government reach. Her stomach twisted. She walked past his row, stealing a glance at his boarding pass. Mason Rourke. No title, no status indicator, just a name. Fake. Her pulse quickened. She had worked flights carrying high-profile individuals before, and she knew when someone on board wasn't just another passenger. Rourke wasn't here by accident. And neither was Big Shaq. The smirk that said too much. Eleanor exhaled, slow and deliberate, adjusting her posture like a queen settling into her throne. She reached for her champagne flute, took a measured sip, and then, without looking at him, spoke again. You didn't expect to see me here, did you? Shaq watched her for a moment before responding. No. Eleanor smiled, satisfied. Well, neither did I. But fate has a funny way of forcing old ghosts to meet again. Old ghosts. The words sat between them like a lit fuse, waiting for the spark. At that exact moment, Amelia's earpiece crackled. Amelia, report to the galley immediately. Her pulse spiked. The voice belonged to Captain Reynolds, and he never used that tone unless something was wrong. She cast a final glance at Rourke before heading toward the front of the cabin. Shaq, still unreadable, tilted his head slightly. You're enjoying this, aren't you? Eleanor's lips curled. Oh, very much. Shaq exhaled slowly, shaking his head. You always did love the theatrics. Eleanor's smile faltered, just for a fraction of a second. And that's when Shaq knew. She was bluffing. She didn't know everything. She was fishing. And that was dangerous. For both of them. The message that changed everything. Amelia reached the galley, her heartbeat hammering as she pulled the curtain closed behind her. Captain Reynolds was waiting, his expression unusually tense. We have a problem. She braced herself. What kind? He held up the cockpit's security tablet. A message was displayed across the screen in bold red letters. There is a compromised individual on board. Her stomach dropped. Who sent this? She asked. Reynolds shook his head. No idea. It was transmitted before the Wi-Fi went down. Amelia's mind raced. Compromised. Did that mean a threat? A fugitive? A leak? And most importantly, who was the message referring to? Reynolds' voice lowered. You need to tell me. A sharp knock on the galley door made them both jump. A male voice followed. Flight attendant. Open up. Amelia's breath hitched. It was Mason Rourke, the government man, and he sounded impatient. Back in the cabin. Eleanor had gone back to sipping her drink, but her fingers tapped rhythmically against the tray table. A signal. A habit. A nervous tick. Shaq watched her, his mind working through possibilities. Eleanor wasn't just here for a luxury flight. She was waiting for something. Or someone. And then, in the periphery of his vision, the businessman in seat 3A made a move. He stood up. Passengers turned to look, sensing another spectacle about to unfold. Eleanor's smirk returned. And then she whispered, just for Shaq to hear. The real fun is just beginning. Shaq barely had a second to process her words before seat 3. He opened his mouth and said the words that changed everything. I need to speak to the captain. Now. The first-class cabin of Flight 762 was no longer just a confined luxury space. It had turned into a silent battlefield. Tension sat thick in the air, unspoken, yet undeniable. The passengers, once indifferent to each other, were now watching, listening, calculating. Eleanor Whitmore had lost her composure. The confident, entitled woman who once demanded Big Shaq's removal was no longer in control. Her fingers trembled slightly as she clutched her champagne glass, her gaze darting toward the crew members, scanning them as though expecting something, or someone, to act. Big Shaq remained unbothered, his posture relaxed, yet alert. He had felt this before. The quiet hum before a storm. The invisible gears turning behind the scenes. Something was about to shift. And then, it did. A flight attendant named Julian moved casually through the aisle, refilling drinks, collecting empty plates, and flashing a professional smile at passengers. He was young, maybe late 20s, with neatly combed blonde hair and the kind of charm that made passengers trust him without thinking twice. But Shaq? Shaq noticed everything. The way Julian's eyes lingered a second too long on him. The way he adjusted the cuffs of his uniform in a controlled, deliberate manner. The way his fingers tapped subtly against the tray, a rhythm that wasn't random. A code. A signal. Shaq didn't react, but his mind sharpened. Julian wasn't just another flight attendant. He was here for a reason. And Shaq had a gut feeling it had something to do with him. Julian reached Shaq's row, offering a polite, practiced smile. Can I get you anything else, sir? Shaq met his gaze, holding it for a beat longer than necessary. I'm good. Julian nodded, but instead of moving on, he lingered. Too long. And then, turbulence. The plane jerked violently, causing a few gasps from passengers. Champagne sloshed over glass rims, and Eleanor nearly dropped hers altogether. Julian reached out, steadying himself against Shaq's seat. That's when Shaq felt it. A slip. A slight movement. Julian's fingers grazing against Shaq's arm. Not an accident, but intentional. And just like that, a small folded note was tucked into Shaq's hand. Julian didn't say a word. He simply smiled, nodded, and moved on as though nothing had happened. Shaq remained still for a moment, his mind processing too many things at once. The turbulence. The note. The way Julian had moved. That wasn't just random air pressure. Someone had caused that shake. And whoever Julian was working for, they wanted Shaq to know it. Carefully, without drawing attention, Shaq unfolded the small piece of paper beneath the table. 5 words. She's lying. Watch the door. His pulse remained steady, but inside his mind sharpened to a fine edge. She's lying. Eleanor? Or someone else? Shaq casually glanced around the cabin, his gaze landing on Eleanor, who was now staring at him with something new in her expression. Not arrogance, not disdain. Fear. Eleanor's fingers trembled slightly as she reached for her napkin, dabbing at the invisible sweat forming on her brow. She had spent the last 30 minutes trying to exert control, trying to turn the situation against Shaq. But now it was slipping. And then Shaq did something that shattered whatever was left of her composure. He leaned in, just slightly, and whispered, "You have no idea what's coming next, do you?" Eleanor's breath hitched. For the first time, the power had shifted. Shaq wasn't playing defense anymore. He was on the attack. Her grip on the armrest tightened. "You shouldn't be on this flight." Her voice cracked. "This isn't a coincidence." Passengers turned, their curiosity piqued again. Her desperation was too loud to ignore. Shaq exhaled, slow and deliberate. "No, it's not." Eleanor's lips parted slightly, as though she wanted to say more. But she didn't, because she had just realized something far worse. Shaq wasn't surprised by what she had just said. He already knew, and that terrified her more than anything else. The game had just begun. The tension inside the first-class cabin of Flight 762 had shifted from discomfort to full-blown paranoia. Every passenger had sensed it, the invisible game being played in front of them. And now, with Eleanor Whitmore's confidence shattered, and Big Shaq sitting like a silent storm ready to strike, the atmosphere had turned into something far more dangerous. Then, the captain's voice crackled through the intercom. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain speaking. I have been informed that there is a security concern on board." Silence. Passengers exchanged nervous glances. A security concern? The captain continued, his voice unnaturally firm. "Until further notice, I am asking all first-class passengers to remain seated. Cabin crew will conduct a brief verification check. This is a routine precaution." Routine? Everyone knew this was anything but routine. Shaq exhaled slowly, glancing toward the front of the cabin where Amelia and 2 other senior flight attendants were whispering among themselves. Eleanor's fingers twitched against the hem of her designer blouse. She looked ready to bolt. Then, without warning, she grabbed her phone. The moment Eleanor swiped her screen, her thumb moving frantically, Amelia was on her. "Ma'am, I need you to put that away." Eleanor's head snapped up. "You don't understand. I have to make a call." Her voice wasn't just demanding this time. It was edged with something sharper, genuine fear. Shaq tilted his head slightly, watching her unravel. She wasn't just afraid of him. She was afraid of whoever was waiting on the other end of that call. Amelia's tone hardened. "No outside communication is permitted at this time." Eleanor shook her head violently. "Listen to me. You need to let me through to the cockpit. I have information the captain needs." The cabin went still. Passengers watched with narrowed eyes. Some had started this flight believing Eleanor was just an entitled woman throwing a tantrum. But now? Now she looked like someone on the edge of losing everything. "Ma'am," Amelia said again, this time more forcefully. "Hand me the phone." Eleanor clutched it like a lifeline. Her throat bobbed. She was calculating. Then, she made a move. Her body twisted, her hand darting out as she attempted to shove past the flight attendant. But Amelia was quicker, blocking her path. Passengers gasped. Eleanor's mask of control finally shattered. "He doesn't belong here," she yelled suddenly, pointing a trembling finger toward Big Shaq. "You need to stop this plane. Do you even know who he is?" Shaq smirked slightly. "Here we go." Amelia, unfazed by Eleanor's outburst, turned to Shaq. "Sir, do you have anything to declare?" Shaq leaned back, folding his arms across his chest. "Nothing that hasn't already been decided." His words were too calculated, too specific. Eleanor's chest rose and fell rapidly. She turned toward the passengers, desperation breaking through her usually composed exterior. "You people don't get it," she hissed. "You think this is about race, about class? Number this man?" She pointed again, eyes burning with something unspoken. "Is not who he says he is." Shaq tilted his head. "Who do I say I am?" The question landed like a gunshot. Eleanor hesitated. Shaq pressed. "Go on. Tell them." She swallowed. Her hands clenched at her sides. She knew. Shaq could see it in her eyes. She knew exactly who he was. But saying it out loud? That was the real trap. A throat cleared. The businessman in seat 3A, who had recognized Shaq from the beginning, finally spoke. "Maybe it's time we stop pretending," he said coolly, his gaze flicking between Eleanor and Shaq. "Because I think we all know by now, this isn't about a first-class seat." Shaq chuckled under his breath. "Smart man." Passengers murmured in agreement. Even those who had initially sided with Eleanor were starting to doubt the narrative. Who was really the threat here? Then, like a perfectly timed act in a play, Julian, the suspicious flight attendant, appeared from the galley. And in his hands, a sealed black briefcase. The energy in the room shifted instantly. That wasn't a standard airline briefcase. Shaq's jaw tightened slightly. He had seen that exact model before. Government issue. Julian stopped near Amelia, lowering his voice. "I need verification before this is opened." Amelia hesitated. "Where did you get this?" Julian's face remained impassive. "The cockpit. It was delivered before takeoff. No one has opened it yet." The businessman in 3A exhaled through his nose, rubbing his temples. "Of course it was." Shaq turned toward Eleanor, watching her reaction. And there it was. A flash of recognition. A flicker of panic. She knew what was inside. Julian unlatched the briefcase, the metallic clicks echoing in the silent cabin. Inside, a single folder. Top of the page, confidential. Shaq leaned forward, his dark eyes scanning the contents without needing to touch them. He already knew what was written inside. Eleanor did too, because she wasn't looking at the file. She was looking at him. Shaq exhaled, shaking his head slightly. "And here I thought I could get some sleep on this flight." The businessman in 3A let out a dry laugh. "Yeah, right." Passengers were fully invested now. Eleanor pressed her hands against the table, trying to keep herself steady. Shaq watched her for a beat longer before finally speaking. "Go on, Eleanor. Tell them." Her eyes widened. Shaq smirked. "Or should I?" The final blow. The businessman in 3A sighed and turned toward the others. "Let's cut to the chase, shall we?" He pointed at Eleanor. "That woman isn't just some rich socialite." He pointed at Shaq. "And he isn't just a random first-class passenger." Passengers leaned forward. "This is a deep-level operation." Murmurs exploded. Shaq chuckled. "Well, that's dramatic." Eleanor slammed her hands against the table. "You were never supposed to be here." Shaq met her gaze, his voice impossibly calm. "Neither were you." Eleanor's entire body trembled, because she knew she had just lost. Shaq leaned back, hands steepled together. "Now, should I land this plane for you? Or would you rather explain why you were so desperate to stop me from reaching London?" Eleanor didn't answer. She couldn't, because she had just realized she was the real threat all along. And now, everyone knew it. The air inside the first-class cabin of Flight 762 had become unbearably thick, heavy with suspicion and something far more dangerous, the truth creeping into the light. Eleanor Whitmore sat perched at the edge of her seat, her chest rising and falling rapidly. Her previous arrogance had melted into something else entirely: desperation. She had lost control of the narrative, and she knew it. But Eleanor Whitmore had spent her entire life bending reality to her will, and she wasn't about to stop now. Eleanor's gaze flickered across the cabin. Her audience was still there. The powerful, the influential, the ones who understood that perception could be more important than reality. If she could turn them against Shaq, she could regain the upper hand. She inhaled sharply, straightened her spine, and forced a tremor into her voice. "Everyone, listen to me." The words came out strained, as if she were holding back tears. A calculated move. Passengers turned toward her, some wary, others intrigued. Eleanor placed a shaking hand on her chest, eyes glistening with false vulnerability. "You are all being deceived." A murmur rippled through the cabin. Shaq remained motionless, watching her with a quiet amusement. He had seen this before. Theatrics designed to manipulate, to distract, to twist the truth into something more convenient. Eleanor continued, voice trembling. "That man," she pointed at Shaq, "is not who you think he is." Some passengers hesitated. The businessman in 3A exhaled sharply. "Here we go." Eleanor ignored him. "I know things, dangerous things, and I am telling you right now, this flight is in serious jeopardy because of him." The cabin filled with whispers of uncertainty. She had them exactly where she wanted them, until a voice from the back of the cabin cut through the noise. "She's lying." All heads turned. A man who had been silent for most of the flight was now sitting forward in his seat, elbows resting on his knees, and his presence alone sent shockwaves through the room. Shaq's lips curled into the faintest smirk. He had been waiting for this. The man was tall, lean, with sharp blue eyes and a face that looked too familiar to be unimportant. But it wasn't until Eleanor saw him, really saw him, that her entire body tensed. Her lips parted. For a moment she looked shaken. Shaq caught the flicker of recognition, the way her fingers gripped the table. She knew him, and that meant one thing. She had secrets buried with him too. The man exhaled, his voice calm but cutting. "Eleanor Whitmore is not a victim." Passengers stiffened. Some who had leaned into Eleanor's performance were now tilting away. "In fact," the man continued, adjusting his cuffs, "she spent years making sure people like him." He nodded toward Shaq. "Don't get to tell their side of the story." Eleanor's nails dug into the fabric of her seat. "You need to stop talking. Now." But he didn't. He turned to the others. "Do any of you even know who she is? What she's done?" Passengers exchanged glances. Shaq said nothing. He didn't need to. This wasn't his moment. It was hers. The woman who had come undone. Eleanor's throat bobbed. "You're making a mistake." The man's expression didn't change. "Funny. That's exactly what you told me before you ruined my life." Passengers gasped. The businessman in 3A let out a knowing chuckle. "Now this is getting good." Eleanor's face twisted in something between rage and panic. "This is slander." Shaq, now fully invested, leaned forward slightly. "Slander requires lies." Eleanor turned on him. "You shut up." Shaq simply smiled. Eleanor's breaths became uneven. Her facade was crumbling, and she knew it. She needed a distraction, a way to shift the power, and she found one. With a sudden jerking motion, Eleanor lunged for the intercom. Passengers flinched. Amelia reached out instinctively, but Eleanor's fingers were already on the button. Her voice came screaming through the cabin speakers. "This flight is compromised. We have to land now." Gasps erupted. Passengers panicked, some gripping their armrests, others shooting to their feet. Chaos. Pure, manufactured chaos. Exactly what Eleanor needed. Julian, the flight attendant with the government briefcase, took 2 strides toward her. "Ms. Whitmore, that is enough." Eleanor turned, eyes blazing. "You don't understand." Shaq stood up, and the entire room froze. The shift was immediate. The whispers died. Even Eleanor, mid-sentence, mid-breakdown, stilled. Shaq let the silence linger. Then, in the calmest voice possible, he said, Sit down. Passengers held their breath. Eleanor swallowed, her throat tight. Shaq's stare didn't waver. And for the first time she looked afraid of him for the right reasons. Not because of who she assumed he was, but because of who he really was. She lowered herself back into her seat, her hands trembling. Shaq exhaled. Good choice. Passengers exchanged glances, their collective confusion reaching its peak. Who was playing whom? And more importantly, what was the real game being played here? Amelia, regaining control, pressed the intercom button. Ladies and gentlemen, there is no immediate danger. Please remain seated while we resolve a minor internal situation. Passengers weren't convinced, because this was no longer just a first-class dispute. This was a high-stakes war of power. Shaq looked down at Eleanor one last time before returning to his seat. You made your move. He tapped his fingers against the tray. Now let's see how you like mine. Eleanor closed her eyes, because she knew this wasn't over. Not even close. The first-class cabin of Flight 762 had transformed from a space of quiet luxury to a courtroom in the sky, and the verdict was moments away. Eleanor Whitmore sat frozen in her seat, her carefully constructed world collapsing around her. The desperation in her eyes had turned into something colder, acceptance. She had lost. She knew it. But Eleanor Whitmore had never been one to go down without a fight. She clenched her fists, her knuckles white, and turned toward Shaq. Her voice was quieter now, more controlled but laced with venom. You think you've won? Shaq exhaled, leaning back in his seat as though this had all been an amusing game. Haven't I? Before Eleanor could respond, the intercom crackled to life again. This is your captain. We have been instructed to maintain our current course and prepare for immediate landing. Security personnel will be boarding upon arrival. Murmurs spread across the cabin. Passengers exchanged uneasy glances, trying to decipher what that meant. Security. For whom? Shaq already knew. Julian, the flight attendant with the sealed briefcase, stepped forward. His face remained unreadable, but his presence alone sent a silent message. This was already out of Eleanor's hands. Passengers straightened in their seats. The truth was close now, hovering just beyond reach. Eleanor exhaled sharply, shaking her head. You're making a mistake. Julian ignored her and turned toward Shaq instead. Sir, I assume you're ready to proceed as planned? Passengers gasped. Eleanor stiffened. Shaq smirked slightly. Of course. Of course. Because he had known all along. Eleanor's breathing grew heavier. The facade of control had cracked beyond repair, and the pieces were falling fast. The businessman in 3A, who had recognized Shaq from the start, exhaled slowly and shook his head. I should have known. This was a trap, wasn't it? Shaq didn't answer, because he didn't need to. Instead, Julian placed the sealed briefcase on the nearest table and unlatched it. The metallic clicks echoed through the cabin, followed by the slow, deliberate movement of a folder sliding into view. Shaq tilted his head. Would you like to read it, Eleanor? Eleanor's throat bobbed. Passengers leaned in, their curiosity overpowering any remaining sense of self-preservation. Julian lifted the first page just enough for Eleanor to see, and just like that, the color drained from her face. Shaq watched, silent and unblinking, as Eleanor read the words that sealed her fate. The silence stretched unbearably. Then, finally, Eleanor let out a slow, shaky breath. You set me up. Shaq offered a small, almost bored smile. No, Eleanor. He leaned in slightly. You set yourself up. I just let you walk into it. Passengers exchanged stunned looks. The air had become so thick with tension that it felt like the walls themselves were closing in. The moment the wheels touched the runway, a new energy flooded the cabin. Outside, through the tiny rounded windows, figures in dark suits were already moving toward the plane. Shaq stretched his arms, exhaling as if this had all been an exhausting, but predictable, day. Well, this has been fun. Eleanor, still gripping the edges of her seat, was out of options. The doors unlatched. The first-class passengers sat perfectly still as security personnel stepped on board. A tall man in a dark suit nodded toward Shaq. Sir, we're ready. Shaq stood, straightening his jacket. He turned to Eleanor one last time, his voice calm and unreadable. Game over. Security moved forward, and for the first time since the flight began, Eleanor had nothing left to say. The final shift of power. Who truly won? As Shaq stepped off the plane, he didn't need to look back to know. He had won long before this flight ever took off. The heat of the tarmac rippled through the air as Big Shaq descended the stairs of Flight 762. The low hum of engines and distant voices created an eerie backdrop, but he barely noticed. His steps were measured, deliberate, as though he had already planned every second of what would happen next. Behind him, the passengers of first class remained seated, held in place by the weight of what they had just witnessed. Eleanor Whitmore sat stiffly, her hands clutching the seat as if letting go would mean admitting defeat. Her carefully curated world had collapsed at 40,000 feet, and now she was simply waiting for the inevitable. 2 black SUVs idled near the terminal. Dark-suited men flanked the vehicles, their expressions unreadable behind tinted shades. Shaq didn't slow. He knew exactly who was waiting for him. A sharp beep from an earpiece. One of the men near the SUV touched his ear, then turned slightly toward Shaq. His voice was calm, controlled. It's done. She doesn't know it yet, but it's already done. Shaq smirked. Of course it was. The pieces had been falling into place long before Eleanor had even stepped onto that plane. She had assumed this was about power, status, privilege. That Big Shaq was nothing more than an outsider who had dared to exist in her world. But she had been wrong. Terribly wrong. This was never about her. This was about what she had been hiding. As Shaq reached the SUV, a phone rang inside. One of the agents opened the door, revealing a small, encrypted device resting on the seat. Shaq picked it up. No caller ID, no traceable signal. He answered anyway. A low voice came through the speaker. Phase 1 complete. Shaq exhaled through his nose. His fingers tightened around the phone for a brief moment before he spoke. Proceed with Phase 2. There was no response. Just a soft click as the call disconnected. Shaq slid into the SUV, the door closing behind him with a final deliberate thud. Back inside the aircraft, Eleanor let out a slow, shaky breath. It wasn't supposed to end like this. She had spent years building her influence, making sure people like Big Shaq stayed exactly where she wanted them, on the outside. But now, she was the one trapped. She turned toward the nearest flight attendant. I need to make a call. The attendant didn't even blink. I'm sorry, ma'am, but you won't be making any calls for a long time. Eleanor's stomach twisted. Outside, the black SUVs began to move, disappearing into the airport's restricted zone. She had assumed she was the predator, but she had been the prey all along. As the first-class passengers were escorted off the plane, whispers filled the air. Some were still piecing together what had happened. Others weren't sure they wanted to know. One thing was certain, this wasn't just about a seat in first class. And Big Shaq? He had never been just another passenger. This was just the beginning of Big Shaq's story. Eleanor thought she could control the narrative. She was wrong. Now, the real game is in motion. And trust us, you don't want to miss what happens next. Who is really pulling the strings? And most importantly, who was this flight actually a trap for? Subscribe now, follow for updates, and stay tuned. Because the next twist is coming, and it's bigger than you think. Buckle up. This ride isn't over.